In the summer of 1789, Paris was not simply a city facing hardship. It was a city psychologically cornered. Every day felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of centuries of inequality had finally settled onto the shoulders of ordinary people. Hunger was not just a physical pain, it became a constant reminder of abandonment. Bread shortages were no longer occasional crises, but part of daily life. People woke up already exhausted, knowing the struggle would repeat itself. The sound of empty stomachs was matched only by the silence from those in power. The monarchy still existed in palaces far removed from the streets, while the streets themselves had become places of quiet desperation. At this point, the revolution was not yet a roar. It was a whisper, shared between neighbors, carried through markets, spoken in lowered voices, but growing stronger with each passing day. Rumors filled the void left by uncertainty. Paris had become a city addicted to speculation, because speculation was the only form of control people felt they still had. One day, it was said that the king had accepted reform. The next, that troops were gathering to crush the National Assembly. Foreign soldiers, especially Swiss and German mercenaries, were rumored to be moving closer to the city, loyal not to France but to royal authority. These stories spread faster than truth ever could. They moved through taverns, churches, workshops, and breadlines. Fear does not wait for confirmation. Fear multiplies on its own. By early July, Parisians no longer trusted official announcements. They trusted their instincts, and their instincts told them that danger was approaching. The presence of soldiers only intensified this belief. Uniformed men patrolled the streets with muskets visible, cannons positioned at key points around the city. To the crown, these were defensive measures meant to restore order. To the people, they looked like preparations for war against their own population. The idea that the king might turn his army on Paris felt like a final betrayal. For many, this was the moment loyalty died. Not in a dramatic act, but quietly, internally, when people realized that the system they lived under did not see them as citizens, only as risks to be controlled. Above all this tension stood the Bastille, silent and unmoving, yet more present than ever. Its dark towers dominated the skyline, casting literal and symbolic shadows over nearby streets. To walk near it was to be reminded of invisible power, of letters signed in secret, of men arrested at night, of families never given explanations. Most Parisians had never seen the inside of the fortress, but they did not need to. The Bastille existed in the collective imagination as a place where justice disappeared. Its walls represented centuries of unaccountable authority. In times of calm, it was ignored. In times of crisis, it became unbearable. And July 1789 was a time of crisis. As July 14th approached, the atmosphere in Paris changed noticeably. Conversations grew sharper. People stopped speaking in hypotheticals and started speaking in certainties. Something was going to happen. The question was no longer if, but when. Early on the morning of that day, crowds began forming almost instinctively. There was no single leader calling people into the streets. No official plan. Fear itself was the organizer. People gathered because staying alone at home felt more dangerous than standing together outside. The goal at first was not attack. It was preparation. Parisians believed an assault was coming, and they refused to be defenseless when it arrived. Men began searching for weapons wherever they could be found. Armories were broken into. Old muskets were pulled from storage. Some weapons were barely functional, relics of past wars, but they were taken anyway. By midday, tens of thousands of firearms were in civilian hands. An extraordinary and dangerous transformation. Ordinary workers suddenly carried the tools of violence. But quickly, another problem became clear. Muskets without gunpowder were useless, and everyone knew where the gunpowder was stored. Inside the Bastille. At that moment, the fortress stopped being just a symbol. It became a target. By early afternoon, a massive crowd had gathered outside the Bastille's gates. The mood was tense but restrained, balanced between fear and determination. Shouts echoed against the stone walls, demanding the release of the gunpowder, the removal of cannons, and reassurance that the fortress would not fire on the city. Delegates were sent inside to negotiate. For hours, the situation hovered on the edge of disaster. Inside the Bastille, Governor Bernard René Delaunay faced a nightmare scenario. He commanded a small garrison, limited supplies, and had received no clear instructions from the royal government. He knew that if he fired on the crowd, the consequences would be catastrophic. Yet if he surrendered control, he would be betraying the crown he had sworn to serve. Time dragged on painfully. The sun moved higher, the heat intensified, and patience evaporated. Every delay felt intentional. Every closed gate felt like an insult. Outside, the crowd swelled, fueled by exhaustion, fear, and the growing belief that they were being deceived. The longer nothing happened, the more dangerous the situation became. People began to assume the worst. That the Bastille was buying time. That soldiers were on their way. That this was all a trap. In moments like this, logic loses its power. Emotion takes control. And once emotion dominates a crowd, restraint becomes fragile. Somewhere in that chaos of waiting, misunderstanding, and raw tension, the fragile line holding the situation together finally snapped. No one standing outside the Bastille that afternoon believed they were about to witness history in the making. What they felt was not destiny, but pressure. The unbearable pressure of waiting too long in a moment that demanded resolution. The crowd had been standing for hours, bodies packed tightly together, sweat mixing with dust, voices growing hoarse from shouting demands that seemed to vanish into stone. Faces were tense, eyes constantly shifting between the closed gates, the towers above, and the people pressed shoulder to shoulder beside them. Every sound felt amplified. Every movement felt suspicious. In this atmosphere, even silence became threatening. It was the kind of silence that convinces people something terrible is about to happen. Inside the Bastille, confusion mirrored the chaos outside. Governor Delaunay paced through dim corridors, aware that every decision he made could lead to catastrophe. He could hear the distant roar of the crowd through the thick stone walls, a low, constant sound like an approaching storm. His soldiers were nervous, some barely trained, others old veterans who understood exactly how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Supplies were limited. Food was scarce. Reinforcements were uncertain. And still, no clear orders arrived from Versailles. The fortress, once a symbol of absolute authority, now felt isolated, abandoned, and dangerously exposed. Outside, impatience turned into suspicion. The crowd began to believe negotiations were a lie, a tactic meant to delay until royal troops arrived to crush them. People shouted that they were being tricked, that the Bastille was preparing to fire. That surrender would never come. Fear fed on itself, passing from person to person faster than reason could intervene. In crowds, emotion spreads like fire, and by mid-afternoon, Paris was burning with it. Individuals no longer thought as individuals. They thought as a single volatile mass, unified by anxiety and anger. Then came the moment no one could undo. A sudden movement near the gates, a shout, a sharp crack that cut through the air like lightning. A single gunshot echoed across the courtyard. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Then came another shot, and another. Whether fired by accident or panic no longer mattered. The sound alone was enough. In that instant, fear transformed into survival instinct. People screamed. Some turned to flee. Others raised their muskets and fired blindly toward the fortress. Smoke exploded into the air, thick and choking. The space between the crowd and the Bastille became a killing ground. Men fell. Some struck by bullets. Others trampled as panic rippled outward. Blood stained the stones, turning a place of protest into a battlefield. The Bastille answered with force. Muskets fired from its walls. Cannons roared, tearing through nearby streets and buildings. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the crowd, not just physically, but psychologically. This was no longer a negotiation. It was war. And most of those fighting had never intended to fight at all. Hours passed in a blur of chaos and terror. The attackers were untrained civilians, bakers, craftsmen, laborers, people whose hands had never held weapons meant to kill. They fired wildly, reloaded clumsily, learned through desperation. Yet they kept advancing. Not because they believed victory was certain, but because retreat felt impossible. To turn back now would mean accepting fear again. And fear, once confronted, become something people refused to return to. As the afternoon dragged on, exhaustion set in. Smoke filled the air so thickly that the sun dimmed behind it. Shouts blended into screams. Orders were lost. Bodies lay where they fell, some moving, some terrifyingly still. The crowd's original purpose, gunpowder, protection, reassurance, had dissolved completely. What remained was raw confrontation between authority and the people it had ruled for centuries. Then, slowly, the balance began to shift. Soldiers from the French Guard arrived, men trained in warfare, disciplined and experienced. They had been sent to maintain order, but many sympathized with the crowd. They had lived among the people. They shared the same shortages, the same frustrations. One by one, they made a choice that would change everything. They turned their weapons toward the Bastille, with proper coordination and firepower now on the side of the attackers. The fortress's advantage evaporated. What once seemed unassailable began to look vulnerable. Inside the Bastille, reality closed in. Governor Delaunay understood the truth that could no longer be denied. The fortress would fall. If it fell by force, no one inside would survive. The walls that had symbolized royal authority for centuries would become a tomb. Faced with this, Delaunay chose surrender. It was not a noble decision, nor a cowardly one. It was a desperate attempt to stop the bloodshed before it consumed everyone. When the gates finally opened, the fighting stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was unsettling. Smoke drifted through the courtyard. The crowd surged forward cautiously, unsure whether this was victory or another trick. Some cheered. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by what they had just survived. The Bastille had fallen, not with ceremony, but with exhaustion and disbelief. Yet even in that moment of triumph, something dangerous lingered in the air. Because surrender ends battles, but it does not end rage. When the gates of the Bastille opened and the crowd poured inside, there was no clear feeling of victory, only shock. The interior of the fortress felt smaller than many had imagined, almost disappointing in its emptiness. Dark corridors, damp stone walls, iron doors that led to only a few prisoners. Some people laughed nervously. Others stared in silence. The symbol that had haunted Paris for generations was suddenly exposed as fragile, almost ordinary. But symbols do not lose their power simply because they fall. Instead, they often release something far more dangerous when they collapse. In that moment, the Bastille stopped being a prison and became a trigger. Governor Bernard-René Delaunay was taken into custody amid confusion and noise. At first, there was talk of escorting him safely to the Hôtel de Ville for questioning. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that order might still prevail. But outside the fortress, the atmosphere had already shifted beyond control. The crowd that endured hours of fear, gunfire, and death was no longer thinking about justice or procedure. Rage had replaced restraint. The emotional dam had broken. As Delaunay was dragged through the streets, insults rained down on him, followed by blows. Each strike fed the next. In the absence of authority, the crowd became its own judge, jury, and executioner. What followed happened quickly, but its impact would last for centuries. Delaunay was beaten, stabbed, and killed before any formal trial could occur. His death was not planned. It was impulsive, emotional, and fueled by collective fury. Then came the act that marked the true transformation of the revolution. His head was severed and placed on a pike, lifted above the crowd, and carried through the streets of Paris. It was not done quietly. It was done publicly, deliberately, as a message. Authority had been humiliated. Power had changed hands. When Parisians saw the severed head held high, many cheered. Others felt something colder settle in their stomachs. Even those who celebrated understood, deep down, that a line had been crossed that could never be erased. As night fell over Paris, the city entered a strange, unsettling state. Bells rang in celebration. Fires burned. Crowds moved through the streets, shouting, singing, and embracing. Yet beneath the noise was an undercurrent of fear. This was not the joy of stability, but the exhilaration of chaos. People sensed that the rules governing their world had dissolved overnight. If a governor could be killed without trial, then no position was truly safe. Nobles locked their doors. Officials fled. Neighbors began to look at one another with suspicion. The night was alive, restless, uncertain of what it had just become. News of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly beyond Paris. In towns and villages across France, the event was interpreted not as an isolated incident, but as a signal. If the people of Paris could overthrow a symbol of royal authority, then anything was possible. Peasants rose against landlords. Manor houses were attacked. Records of feudal obligations were burned in bonfires, as if destroying paper could erase centuries of oppression. Fear traveled just as quickly as hope. For the privileged, the Bastille's fall was a warning. For the desperate, it was permission. When word reached King Louis XVI, the gravity of the situation was not immediately clear to him. Removed from the streets, surrounded by ceremony and routine, the king reportedly asked whether the events in Paris were merely a revolt. The response he received changed everything. No, it was not a revolt. It was a revolution. In that simple distinction lay the end of the old world. Revolts could be crushed. Revolutions rewrote reality. The night the French Revolution turned violent was not simply about the fall of a fortress. It was about the moment ideals lost their innocence. It was the moment when hope learned how to kill, and when the people discovered both their power and its cost. History often remembers revolutions for what they promise, but it is nights like this that reveal what they demand in return: blood, fear, and consequences that echo far beyond the moment itself.